The Iron Curtain speech changed the world forever on March 5, 1946. Winston Churchill, the wartime hero who had saved democracy from fascism, stood at a podium in Fulton, Missouri, and declared that Europe was now divided by an Iron Curtain stretching from the Baltic to the Adriatic. In the audience, President Harry Truman nodded grimly, knowing that Churchill was announcing the end of the wartime alliance and the beginning of a new kind of conflict. But here's what makes this moment so remarkable. Churchill was a private citizen when he gave this speech. He wasn't prime minister anymore. The British people had voted him out of office just months after he'd won World War II. Yet his words that day would define the next 45 years of global politics and create the ideological framework that still shapes our world today. This wasn't just political rhetoric. This was the moment when the free world drew a line in the sand against totalitarian expansion. When democratic nations said, "We will not allow freedom to be extinguished again." It was the birth of the political alliance system that protects democratic values today. NATO, the EU, the partnerships that ensure we can vote for our leaders instead of having them imposed by force. This is the story of how one speech transformed allies into enemies and created the Cold War, but also how it established the democratic foundations that allow us to choose our governments today. What happened to Churchill between 1945 and 1946 perfectly illustrates why democracy is humanity's greatest political invention, even when it seems to produce frustrating results. In July 1945, just 2 months after defeating Nazi Germany, Churchill faced the British voters in a general election. This was the man who had saved civilization, who had stood alone against Hitler when all seemed lost, who had rallied the free world to victory. Surely the British people would reward him with a landslide victory. Instead, they voted him out of office in a crushing defeat. The Labour Party won 393 seats to Churchill's Conservatives' 213. The greatest wartime leader in British history was suddenly unemployed. American observers were stunned. How could a democracy be so ungrateful? But Churchill himself understood what many dictators never grasp. In a democracy, leaders serve at the pleasure of the people, not the other way around. "The people have spoken," he said graciously, "and I accept their verdict." This is what makes democracy beautiful and sometimes maddening. Unlike in Putin's Russia, where critics are imprisoned or poisoned, or Xi Jinping's China, where dissent is crushed, democratic leaders must constantly earn the trust of their citizens. They can be fired by voters, criticized by free press, challenged by opposition parties. It's messy, it's frustrating. But it's the only system that puts power in the hands of ordinary people. Churchill's electoral defeat actually strengthened his moral authority for what came next. When he spoke at Fulton, he wasn't a sitting prime minister pursuing national interests. He was a democratic statesman warning the free world about a gathering threat. The contrast with Stalin couldn't have been starker. While Churchill was voted out by his own people, Stalin was systematically murdering anyone who might challenge his rule. While Britain's new Labour government was implementing universal health care and expanding worker rights, Stalin was imposing brutal dictatorships across Eastern Europe. Churchill's Fulton speech was political dynamite disguised as academic rhetoric. Officially titled "The Sinews of Peace," it was delivered at Westminster College in Missouri, with President Truman sitting right behind him on the platform. But Churchill wasn't there by accident. Truman had privately encouraged the speech, knowing that an American president couldn't yet publicly declare the wartime alliance with Stalin over. Churchill, as a private citizen, could say what Truman couldn't, that the Soviet Union had become a threat to democratic civilization. "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic," Churchill declared. "An iron curtain has descended across the continent." Those words created the central metaphor of the Cold War, the idea that Europe was now divided between free and unfree peoples. But the most important part of Churchill's speech wasn't about Soviet expansion. It was about democratic solidarity. He called for a special relationship between Britain and America, the creation of what would become NATO, and a commitment to defending democratic values worldwide. "This is not the liberated Europe we fought to build up," Churchill warned. "This is not the freedom of Europe that we fought to build up." He was describing something Americans can barely imagine today. Entire nations where people couldn't vote, couldn't speak freely, couldn't travel, couldn't even access information from the outside world. The Soviet response was swift and revealing. Stalin called Churchill a warmonger and compared him to Hitler. But Stalin's real anger wasn't about Churchill's words. It was about the truth they revealed. The Soviet system couldn't survive comparison with democratic societies because it denied people the most basic human right, the right to choose their own government. Churchill's speech crystallized what many democratic leaders already knew but couldn't yet say publicly. The wartime alliance was over, and a new struggle between freedom and totalitarianism had begun. What Churchill proposed at Fulton became the foundation of the modern democratic world order. And it's why we can choose our leaders today instead of having them imposed by force. Within 3 years of Churchill's speech, democratic nations had created an unprecedented alliance system. NATO was founded in 1949, binding democratic countries together in mutual defense. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Europe as a collection of democratic societies. The United Nations, despite Soviet obstruction, became a forum where free nations could coordinate their policies. This wasn't just military alliance. It was ideological solidarity. Democratic nations agreed to defend each other's right to hold free elections, maintain independent judiciaries, and protect individual liberties. When Soviet forces crushed democratic movements in Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968, it was the NATO alliance that provided refuge for those seeking freedom. The contrast with Soviet alliance systems was stark. The Warsaw Pact wasn't voluntary, it was imposed by force. When East Germans tried to vote with their feet by fleeing to West Germany, the Soviets built the Berlin Wall to keep them trapped. When Hungarians demanded free elections, Soviet tanks crushed their revolution. American leadership was crucial to this democratic alliance system. Unlike previous great powers that imposed their will through force, America used its strength to protect and promote democratic institutions. Yes, America made mistakes and sometimes supported unsavory allies. But the fundamental commitment was to a world where people could choose their own governments. This is why Putin's Russia and Xi's China fear NATO and democratic alliances so much today. These partnerships prove that free societies can cooperate without coercion, that democratic nations can defend their values without abandoning their principles. The 45-year Cold War that followed Churchill's speech became the ultimate test of whether democratic systems could compete with totalitarian efficiency. And democracy passed that test spectacularly. While Soviet citizens waited in breadlines, Americans enjoyed the world's highest standard of living. While Eastern Europeans were trapped behind the Iron Curtain, Western Europeans traveled freely and traded prosperously. While Soviet dissidents were sent to gulags, American protesters could march on Washington and change government policy. The most powerful moment came in 1987, when President Reagan stood at the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin and demanded, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." 2 years later, the people of Eastern Europe did exactly that, choosing freedom over security, democracy over dictatorship. The Soviet Union collapsed not because of military defeat, but because its own people rejected the system once they had the chance. The Berlin Wall fell not to American bombs, but to German hammers and pickaxes, wielded by citizens who chose freedom. This is the power of democratic ideals. They're contagious. When people see others choosing their own leaders, governing themselves, speaking their minds freely, they want the same rights. This is why authoritarian regimes today spend so much effort blocking internet access, controlling information, and preventing their citizens from seeing how democratic societies actually work. When I look at Churchill's Iron Curtain speech today, what strikes me most is how relevant his warnings remain. We're facing a new Iron Curtain, this time digital rather than physical, but just as real. Putin's Russia has become an authoritarian state where opposition leaders are murdered, independent media is crushed, and elections are theatrical performances with predetermined outcomes. Xi's China has built the most sophisticated surveillance state in human history, where millions of Uyghurs are imprisoned for their beliefs, and Hong Kong's democracy has been systematically destroyed. Yet the democratic alliance system Churchill envisioned is stronger than ever. NATO has expanded to protect new democracies in Eastern Europe. The European Union has created the world's largest democratic federation. Democratic nations from Japan to Australia to Canada coordinate their responses to authoritarian aggression. Most importantly, the principles Churchill defended: that people should choose their own leaders, that governments should serve their citizens rather than ruling them, that individual liberty is worth defending. These principles are as vital today as they were in 1946. Yes, democracy is messy. Yes, voters sometimes make choices that seem wrong. Yes, the system can be slow and frustrating. But every time we vote, every time we criticize our leaders without fear, every time we change governments peacefully, we're participating in the greatest political achievement in human history. The alternative isn't just authoritarianism. It's the complete loss of human agency in politics, the right to be wrong, to make mistakes, to change our minds. These are the rights that separate free people from subjects of dictators. Churchill's Iron Curtain speech reminds us that democracy isn't automatic or permanent. It requires constant vigilance, active participation, and the courage to defend freedom even when the cost is high. In our next episode, we'll explore how this ideological conflict played out in the first major Cold War crisis, the Berlin blockade, where Stalin tested whether the Democratic Alliance would actually fight to defend freedom. This has been the Story Arc, where we connect the past to the present. I'm your host, and I'll see you next time.